Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Australian Water Partnership's webinar on exploring the water security, fisheries, and gender equality nexus. My name is Shreya Gavali, and I am a Senior Program Officer and the Gender Equality, Disability, and Social Inclusion focal point at the Australian Water Partnership. I would like to begin by acknowledging the Ngunnawal people, traditional custodians of the land on which we gather today and where the AWP is located, here in Canberra, Australia. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and thank them for their continued care of land and waterways. I also extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today, and I would also like to acknowledge any other First Nations or Indigenous people joining us today from the region or globally. The Australian Water Partnership is a water for development institution funded by the Australian government to support climate resilient water resource management in the Asia Pacific region. This webinar will showcase a panel of experts who collectively explore the complex relations between water security, fisheries, and gender equality. Insightful discussions and knowledge exchange will show how to create a more inclusive approach to fisheries and water management sectors. While fisheries are the focus of the case studies, the findings and recommendations are applicable to water and agricultural projects more broadly. We will also be launching a learning brief, which provides actionable insights for fostering inclusivity within fisheries and water management sectors. It provides in-depth research of women's role in fisheries and explores the interconnections of water, food, and gender using case studies. This work draws on the Next Generation Irrigation and Water Management for Asia Pacific program, the NextGen program implemented by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations in partnership with Australian partners, Institute of Sustainable Futures, University of Technology, Sydney, Charles Sturt University, and Blackwatch Consulting, supported by the Australian Water Partnership to modernize Asia's irrigation systems and water management practices to achieve long-term sustainable food security. I now present to you our brief agenda for the day. We will hear from 3 speakers, and then we'll have some time for questions from the audience. During the course of the webinar, if you have any questions, please put them in the Zoom Q&A box, not the Zoom chat. And I'd just like to mention that the webinar is being recorded and will be made available on AWP's website if you would like to access it later. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker for today, Dr. Victoria Siddle from Ocean Research Consulting and University of Auckland. Victoria is an environmental, marine, gender, and fisheries science and policy specialist with over 10 years of experience in policy, research, and project management of complex issues in New Zealand and the Pacific. Over to you, Victoria.
Thank you, Shreya. Good afternoon, everybody. I thank you for inviting me to speak on this, and I'm really excited to launch today. So without further talking, I would like to today to present to you the methodology, how we developed the report, go over a brief overview of the nexus between fisheries, water security, and gender equality, present some of the concepts and ideas from a desktop study that we applied to 2 of the case studies, and present some of the key principles we've developed for practitioners when applying to their fisheries when considering GEDC, or gender equality and social inclusion. Next slide, please. So the aim for the report was to better understand women's roles in fisheries and explore those interconnections between the water, food, and gender, and how they should be considered for the benefit of waterways, fisheries, and fishing communities' health and well-being. The methodology included a qualitative study which included a literature review and case study literature as well, and identified some of the research gaps which we provide in the report. We also conducted 2 case studies to further explore the nexus issues. This included the Fish Tech project in Southeast Asia and the small-scale fisheries in Myanmar. We came up, thanks. We came up with some recommendations across the project cycle and developed a GEDC framework with some principles applied to each stages of a project cycle. Now you can go, thank you. So just wanted to touch on the nexus between fisheries, water and gender equality. And the relationship of these 3 dimensions, because they're so critical to the livelihoods and well-being of millions of people, especially those reliant on rivers. They form what's also known as a social ecological system, which are nested multi-level systems and dynamic and complex. They interlink and have feedback loops, drivers, and face multiple stresses and cumulative effects, which I can cover in the next slide. Oh no, back, not yet. And so issues in either of these domains can cause problems in others. For example, a dam is great for securing water, generating electricity and managing floods. However, they may cut off the flow to downstream communities and stop fish from migrating upstream. And these changes can impact women and men differently due to the different roles that they play in fisheries supply chains and generally in the household and in communities and villages. Adaptive measures that are made without a gender equality approach or GEDC approach can have unintended negative impacts on particularly on minority groups such as women. Okay, now please, next slide. So here's a figure of a social ecological system. They're inherently complex, as you can see, and become increasingly open with processes such as globalization. This is an example of a marine or freshwater ecosystem I actually developed from my PhD research and was published last year, and I adapted it for this particular project with the thought of freshwater fisheries as well. It's important to note not just the domains, but the interlinkages, which are really important because they impact changes and processes on other dimensions via feedback loops. The scale and context down the bottom have either strong or weak links. Strong links can be economic through globalization, development aid, and trade, or weak links can be institutional, gender equality mainstreaming, or and policy diffusion. So it's really important to understand a social ecological system, what drives it, and identifying areas of strong interaction to understand the causation, and so that can then help with identifying solutions. So why consider gender equality and inclusion in fisheries? Generally, fisheries are described as women-intensive but male-dominated. Women workers are consistently overrepresented in low-skilled, poorly paid and undervalued positions, while men dominate more powerful, higher-skilled, better-paid, more valued positions. Women's roles are often invisible, and there has been little attention paid to these roles. So the misunderstandings and lack of awareness can lead to unintended outcomes and reinforce status quos, such as deep-rooted social and cultural norms, which structure gender inequalities. Also known as maladaptation when you're implementing mainstream policies. And these can leave individuals, communities and villages less resilient and more vulnerable to impacts from things like climate change. To achieve gender equality, you really need to dismantle stereotypes and understand holistically the social ecological system and the equality issues, and apply more of a multi-scalar and integrative approach. So let's see what the kind of roles women play in fisheries. This is a table showing the predominant gendered roles acted by women and men in small-scale fisheries. Just a disclaimer, a lot of the fisheries and gender research has been on women and men only, and however, there is more research into intersectional approaches to fisheries. But let me continue. The top row shows us how women and men's roles are divided between the more generic roles listed in the bottom row. And this information was developed based on multiple case studies from Southeast Asia. So it goes along the value chain from pre-fishing, fishing, fish processing, trading, and then on the right is looking at the governance, finance, and household and those roles within those. Let it be known that there are differences. Oh, go back. Sorry. Differences between fisheries and locations, and this is because of the social ecological context, but also timing of the roles undertaken. So, for example, some women fish at night, all night, just so that they can fit in their household responsibilities and other work responsibilities during the day. How they are undertaken also has differences. Men are most likely to be fishing using motorized boats or further afar, and use those boats to access markets, whereas women are fishing more near shore and using public transport. Access to resources and finance there's also differences, and variations depend on age, household circumstances, and ethnicity, and other differences. There are those that act outside the norm due to necessity and differing contexts or changing norms. But it's important to note that women involved in a particular role may not necessarily equate to gender inclusion. Men often identify women in the roles as substitutes for themselves in decision-making roles. Next slide, please. So here are some 8 principles that we developed that essentially guides a GEDC fisheries program. I won't go through them all, and you can look at the report for more information, but just to touch on a few, the key principles including valuing women's roles within the fishery and including marginalised voices are key by including them in decisions that impact them. For example, including their input in fisheries management has allowed for better outcomes in the Fish Tech program, which will be covered through soon, by adapting fish ladders to allow for smaller fish caught by women to migrate upstream to their fishing grounds. Transformative change requires addressing root of issues, which includes removing obstacles to genuine choice and accommodating differences by redesigning roles or to fit in with or change women's expected responsibilities. For example, if women want to work on boats, changing the facilities on board so that they can go far, and also those responsibilities expected of them at home. Another key principle is to consider that each context is unique, so applying a social ecological systems approach to reveal the differential opportunities and challenges for men and women, to tailor those policies and programs based on that intersectionality of individuals and the social ecological relations of that specific fishery. It requires getting data that's disaggregated by sex, but also age, ethnicity, and other relevant social categories. So with having a better understanding of a social ecological system and the gender equalities associated with it, projects can implement initiatives that can lead to transformative changes towards gender equal fisheries, which is ultimately essential to progressing sustainable development in fisheries and water management forums. Thanks, Fred.
Thanks, Victoria. Really, thank you for unpacking the complexities of the nexus and really emphasizing that social and ecological issues are interlinked across scales and contexts. Our next speaker today is Dr. John Connellan from the Gulbali Institute at Charles Sturt University. John is a senior researcher within the Inland Fisheries Research Group at Gulbali Institute. He has been working in the natural resource management field for over 20 years and on fisheries and irrigation food nutrition security projects for the last 10 years. Although he has a technical management background, he dedicates most of his time to the human aspects within projects and the motivations and abilities of stakeholders to implement and institutionalize project learnings. Over to you, John.
Thanks, Freya, for the introduction. Yes, so my name is John Connellan. I'm representing the Inland Fisheries Research Group within the Gulbali Institute at Charles Sturt University in Australia. I'm representing actually the project leader, Professor Lee Baumgartner. He couldn't be here today. He's currently in Indonesia. And also our JEDSI partner, Mia Urbano, who's been helping us with the JEDSI Pacific components of our project. I'll be presenting today the project which is called FishTech, which is about integrating technical solutions, technical fishery solutions into river development programs across Southeast Asia. And you might think, how does JEDSI relate to technical aspects of concrete and steel? And that's basically what I'm going to concentrate on today. FishTech is a long-running next project of a decade, over a decade-long investment in Southeast Asia from ACR and DFAT in this space around fisheries and irrigation and working within those integrated landscapes. And the main focus of those projects is around food and nutrition security within the Mekong region. And yeah, in the talk, I'm basically going to outline some of the technical aspects of the programs and how we're now trying to incorporate we have always and are continuing to incorporate the human or the people aspects into the technological side of incorporating fish-friendly infrastructure into irrigated landscapes. And that really forms the basis of it. So next slide. So where is, so FishTech, as I said, is a long-running program from investments from ACR and more recently DFAT into the Mekong region. So the basis of these programs has been around fish-friendly infrastructure and really increasing fisheries production within these irrigated landscapes with that focus on food and nutrition security and more recently climate resilience across the Mekong region. This project's Indonesia, Cambodia and Laos. Previously it was also in Myanmar before the coup occurred, and that's no longer the case. The project basis is around the Sustainable Development Goals, and that relates to Sustainable Development Goal 1, so poverty, 2, hunger, 5, gender, 10, inequality, 13, climate, and 17, partnerships. So that shows the importance really around how fisheries and irrigated landscapes and rice production are really at the basis of a lot of development within Southeast Asia. So what we've been working on is that when I don't think you can see my mouse. Is that possible? But anyway, I'll talk you through it. Anyway, so that basically where that mouse is now pointing is the fishway. What happens is that you want to grow more rice. So you do, as we've done in all countries, you put a weir across the river that blocks the water backs up and you're able to irrigate rice. At the same time, that then blocks the migration of fish. And lots of fish, all fish need to move, but lots of fish need to migrate to complete their life cycle. And if you block their migration routes with irrigated infrastructure, then you'll actually end up losing them because they're unable to breed and unable to maintain their populations. So that has a serious impact on local communities, on commercial fisheries, and also on the ecology of the system. And the basis of building a fishway is around passing those fish through the structure. So you can see there, we've got the fishway entrance, the fish swim up, and the fish get through. And you may ask, you say, well, why can't they just jump over the weir? Salmon are very good at jumping, and Southeast Asian fish and most other fish in the world are very, very poor swimmers and cannot pass structures even 40 or 50 centimetres or even 20 centimetres high. So it doesn't take much to block the migration route of fish. And if you think about a region like the Mekong that has, well, in the Mekong River itself, over 800 species of fish moving up and down it, then you start to create some serious challenges around maintaining inland fisheries. So that's the basis of the program, is around fish-friendly solutions within irrigated landscapes. Fisheries is fishways is our main component that we focus on, and passing fish through those fishways upstream or laterally as well, so onto the floodplain, so that people still have access to those fish. In our previous programs over the last decade, we have always had a people-focused type projects, in the sense that we build fishways mainly to pass all sizes of fish. And with that comes actually comes challenges around designing the fishway, but also comes challenges around cost. Passing larger fish is less expensive and somewhat easier than passing very, very small fish. But we know to the local communities within the Mekong region that these small fish are super important to basically their food and their nutrition security. So that's something that we've learned over the last decades and we've been incorporating into it. We have a focus around having fisheries and irrigation departments working together on this. So we're bringing together those different departments to work together on the solutions, as opposed to, well, fisheries is fisheries and irrigation is irrigation. We take an integrated approach. We do bring in community aspects into that. So what is important to the communities in those areas. And then in the previous programs, we've also done some initial cost benefit analysis of the fishway. How long does it take to pay back, which is very important for lenders and for countries themselves that have to build these fishways, and then they do have to pay them back to whoever they're borrowing the money from. And I would say, though, in relation to JEDSI and in relation to the people side of how we've done things, apart from that integration at our own level, our reporting and our ability to monitor has been somewhat output sort of metric based around numbers of women, numbers of children, those styles. So as we came into fish tech, we really realised that, or we already had realised, but we realised even more that it was more important in relation to how do we actually actuate something like JEDSI. So that became a major part of fish tech. So we formalised it in more a structured way. We had a GEDSI strategy written specifically for, so we had a GEDSI strategy written specifically for the project. We've been conducting some case studies specifically around the GEDSI aspects. So we are, the fishway that you see there, we're building one of those in Cambodia at the moment. And so we've been studying the actual community aspects of that fishway, and does it benefit those local people? Who are those local people? What is really our target in relation to building the fishway? And in the future, I would say that, yeah, we'll continue to take that approach of sort of more formalised and a more integrated, and as importantly, having a focus on how we actually going to report on this and show that it actually does make a difference within our program, and it does relate back to the food and nutrition security, and it does relate back to the sustainable development goals. So we're working on that now within FishTech, and as I said, we have good support from DFAT and ACR on that. We also have a GEDSI consultant that we're working with to help us, one, produce a strategy, but two, really find out ways to actuate it and to bring it in from that theoretical basis of often what it can be, especially from an academic point of view, into actual reality in the field. So how do we actually do this in the field? And that's, yeah, so as I said before, taking sort of a case study approach is we're finding very effective. So moving on, next slide. So why is inclusion important to designing and implementing and maintaining fishways? Basically, I mean, this really simple answer is so we know who we're building the fishway for. And fish for whom is a question we ask ourselves. We published a paper on that around the basis of who are we designing these fishways for, and that's really taking this targeted approach. And I'll explain it in the way that if we're looking at commercial fisheries, we'll build very different fishways to if we're looking at community-based benefit fishways. And in the past, we have had many of those conversations in country about, okay, what type of fishway are we building? Another really important component, which relates back to the SDGs again and relates back to the basis of our food and nutrition security projects, is again this fish for whom is around the most marginalised groups. One of the discussions that we've had, we had this discussion in Myanmar, and we're starting to find some data to support this in Cambodia, is around the landless populations that are occurring in those regions. They don't have access to land, fisheries, the subsistence and the basis of those fisheries is really what's sustaining them. And from a social aspect, with local populations, landless and migrants, it's not always, they don't always live in harmony in those situations. So it can cause conflict even within our own teams if it's seen to be that we're focusing on these more marginalised groups, which in some cases they may wish they would just move on. I'll finish off in a way about telling a little bit of a story about fish and the photo here. So if you look at those fish there and you look at the little ones at the top, they may be the fish that will maintain the communities, for instance, that they're eating every day. So those, what may occur, and Slang, which is the Cambodian fishway we're concentrating on, we know from doing the GEDSI studies and some of the other studies that we've been doing, we use a thing called MOTA, which is around the motivations and abilities of people to one, implement a fishway, but also to institutionalize it. And one of the things we found is that the population structure there is predominantly older people, so grandparents and children. The working population is away in the cities and sending money back home. Those small fish at the top and the little browner fish sort of towards the middle, that may be what maintains them every day. And they may catch those fish every day. These are fish that have moved through that fishway at Sling. So we've caught those fish in the fishway. Without that fishway, they would not be moving through. And then if you look at some of those other larger fish to the right, I know they don't seem very large, but they are larger fish, whitebait fish. They may be, to a poorer, more marginalised family, it may be worth more to them to sell those fish, either to a trader or through a local market, and then be able to utilise that money in different ways. So they're a higher utility-based fish. And even just there in that, just that little photo there that we caught out of Sling Fishway last week or the week before, you're looking at over 10 species. So even from an ecological perspective, yeah, and that's just a snapshot of one afternoon of the fish that we've caught. Moving through that fishway, just from so anyway, in the future we intend to have, one of the things that we're looking at now is how we design fishways, is that we design them from the technical components of bringing fisheries and irrigation together. There is some input of the human aspect into it. As we said, what fish are we concentrating on? But we'll try to integrate those JETSI components much more into it. And just from, I'll finish by saying, if this was only about concrete and building fishways, we could have built hundreds, if not thousands, of fishways across Southeast Asia by now. We have the technical expertise to do that. All we really need to know is, what is the headwater, tailwater, and what species of fish do you have? And we can build those fishways. Will they be implemented and institutionalised into the communities that need to own and maintain them into the future? Not a chance. That's why we concentrate so much on the human aspect, even within the technical-based programs that we work within. So thank you, and I look forward to the conversation later on.
Benefits of having a twin track approach of mainstreaming as well as targeting JETSI when we do design, implementation, as well as maintaining projects around fisheries. We now have our final speaker for the day, Melita Grant from the University of Technology, Sydney Institute for Sustainable Futures. Melita specializes in water sanitation and hygiene and integrated water resource management and international development, with a focus on gender equality and inclusion. Over to you, Melita.
Thank you very much, Shreya, and thank you, Victoria and John, for those excellent talks so far, and welcome to everybody. It's wonderful to see people in the chat popping in. We've got colleagues from Laos and from Myanmar, from Cambodia, from all around the region, as well as New Zealand. It's really exciting to see you joining, so thank you for joining us today. We hope that this presentation will be of support to you, and we look forward to your questions. Feel free to pop them in the Q&A box there, and we'll get to the questions just after this little talk. So I'm going to talk about, moving to our next slide. I'm going to talk a bit more about that nexus space. So the project that, the report we're launching today comes from a broader project which we started in 2019. And we gathered people from gender equality inclusion, water management, and agriculture and food security organizations in Myanmar. That's where this project came from. It generated from a nexus cohort. to talk about what are those issues that sit in the center of this nexus. So the Sustainable Development Goals that we really have focused on for this broader project, SDG 2, 5, and 6, and 2 being food security, zero hunger, 5 being gender equality, and 6 being water security and WASH. So we came together and talked about, well, what sits at the center of this nexus in the sorts of contexts that we work in. And we've heard now about that clear connection between fisheries and freshwater resources such as rivers and also the gender equality roles and dynamics that all are connected. And that the blocking the river or the waterway is one way to impact fisheries, but obviously pollution is another, and climate change is another. And all of these factors that impede the biological diversity of our freshwater systems have flow-on effects to the sorts of fish and plants that people can take out of those systems and depend on for their nutrition. And again, the roles and responsibilities for those different elements of life and society are gendered. So we talked about that as a group. We also looked at irrigation dynamics. So who has access to irrigation equipment, to machinery or to pumps, to water licenses or water access. So again, that is gendered in the sense that the people that are able to, say, modernize their irrigation systems or modernize their farms are sometimes more advantaged than those that are marginalized. So there's power dynamics even in the irrigation space. And I've mentioned land and water rights and how they're interconnected. That's another nexus issues that sits at the center here. Who does and doesn't have access to own land? Then issues around nutrition. We know how water, sanitation, and hygiene is connected to nutrition, because if you have poor water, sanitation, hygiene, then your body's unable to absorb the nutrients it needs to be healthy. And so we're seeing high levels of stunting in our region. We're seeing health outcomes not being achieved, even if agricultural programs are progressing. So there's a real focus there on social inclusion and marginalization, water, sanitation, hygiene, and nutrition. And then another example here on this slide is around groundwater management. And again, who has access to that source of water? Who has the machinery or the licenses or the access? And who's able to utilize that resource? It costs more, as we know, to dig deeper, to drill a bore that's deeper. So that brings up socioeconomic issues. And again, that sort of issue sits in the center of this nexus. So moving on to the next slide, I wanted to just introduce you to a framework that we use at the Australian Water Partnership and also in a lot of the gender equality and inclusion work we do in the WASH space, water, sanitation, hygiene space. And I note that one of our participants here today has asked a question about what does transformative change look like? So in the report that we're launching today, we actually canvas this framework, and we also give examples of what transformative change might look like in the fisheries space. I'm just going to very quickly introduce you to this. I'm sure it's familiar to a lot of people, but on the left-hand side of the spectrum, we have approaches when we do a project, natural resource management project, international development project, whatever it is, policy practice, we can take an insensitive approach to differences between people, gender equality, inclusion. We can see everyone as the same or just talk to those that are available or that are already in positions of power. So that would be an insensitive approach. And an insensitive approach can do harm because you're continuing to marginalize and exclude people. Going along the spectrum in the yellow there is a more sensitive approach. And that's where you might be more considerate about people having different needs and roles, doing some analysis of people's needs and roles, and accommodating them. So making accommodations, maybe it's accessibility or transport, or providing a stakeholder engagement session that's at a time that people can attend, outside of their caring duties, etc. So it's making small tweaks, marginal changes. And then in the green, we have a more responsive approach. So that's where you're really doing the work to find out what the social dynamics are in any context, and then actively, proactively working to support different people and bringing their different views into and taking them into account and bringing them into the project. So that's where that twin-tracked approach we're talking about really sits, because you're mainstreaming the thinking of inclusion across all the elements of what you do, but you're also going in and focusing on specific groups that are of need of greater support or attention because they have historically been marginalized. And then now moving to blue, what's transformative? So it's an emerging area. It's not seen a lot in a lot of these sorts of natural resource management projects, but some of the key ways in which we can be transformative is for our organizations that we work in ourselves and that deliver any project or program, or a government agency, doing some transformative change itself. So taking account for increasing capacity and knowledge within the organizations that are delivering programs. It's also about placing people that are traditionally or normally marginalized in positions of leadership and increased power. So shifting those dynamics, giving people a voice, giving people the stage, giving people space to be leaders and to be role models in their own right. And it also involves partnering with organizations that represent people that are often marginalized. So that might be an active engagement with people, organizations for people with disabilities, an active engagement with women's organizations, with sexual gender minorities organizations, and that sort of a partnership approach without drawing on them as volunteers, really engaging in a partnership, brings their insights and expertise into more technical projects that may not be able to see, the technical project or technical approach may not be able to see those potential consequences or unintended consequences that could come from designing a program, a project, a fishway, etc., without considering these sorts of different dimensions, cultural dimensions, roles, the different ways people use and interact with water, with fish, with their environments, safety issues, etc. So transformative approach is really about changing ourselves and our own organizations, partnering with rights holder organizations, and shifting power in terms of providing people, women fishers, for instance, people with disabilities who are selling fish, who are processing fish, who are fishing themselves, putting them in positions of influence. And that starts to shift the perception that they are not important in this sector. Next slide, please. I just want to also mention that spectrum is used a lot in the Water for Women Fund, and it underpins a lot of the work done by that fund. It's also used by the AWP in the policies and in the GEDSI strategies. And that particular version of it that you saw, I thank you to Jessica MacArthur, who created that particular version of the transformative framework. So we have this beautiful graphic in the report, which really summarizes a lot of the key elements of the report in one infographic. And it looks at the project management cycle on the right-hand side in those kind of long bubbles, and looks at what are some of the actions we can take in the pre-design phase, in the design phase, in the implementation phase, and in the monitoring, evaluation, learning phase. So those are quick reminders of, okay, at this phase, I really need to make sure I do ABC to progress a more transformative agenda in the inclusion space. At the center of that circle, we have our social ecological system, which Victoria's talked about, and the interconnections between all those different elements, gender equality, fisheries, and water security. And then on the left-hand side there, GEDSI key principles. They're the key principles Victoria also talked about that are discussed in the report and canvassed in a lot more detail. So this graphic, we hope, will be helpful to people just to jog your memory or to remind you of, okay, these are some concrete ways I could think about considering GEDSI in any project that might have that social ecological system aspect, not just fisheries. Next slide, please. In the report, we outline a range of conclusions and recommendations. And I'm happy to say that these all fit on one page, on page 33 of the report. So really encourage you to click on the link at the end of this webinar and look through the report. It will be familiar to you now because Victoria and I have talked you through a lot of the key elements of it. But this page 33 talks about how we need a holistic approach in terms of that social ecological system, not just looking at individual parts of the system in silos, but in an integrated way, and mapping those interlinkages and looking at those strong and weak links, those power dynamics, etc. So important. We also talk about cross-sectoral engagement. John talked about this beautifully in terms of their engagement with the irrigation departments and the water management departments, which would normally be quite separate and not talk to each other so much. So John and his team have been actively bringing together ministries that might not see that they have so much in common, and then they are both benefiting from the project because you're getting irrigation outcomes and you're also getting biodiversity, fish outcomes, and livelihood outcomes. The improving understanding element is about the need for more research. We've got some ideas around specific research needs that we have identified through the desk-based review, and also the deep knowledge that Victoria in particular brings to this project, having done her PhD in this area. And another conclusion is around intersectionality. As Victoria mentioned, it's not looking at men and women in a binary and a separated way. We're looking at humans in all of their diversity and the way in which inequalities and marginalization can be layered and can be multifaceted. And yes, that brings more complexity to the system, but that is life. And so we need to acknowledge that, and we need to make sure that we better understand the needs of different people and families. The value chain that Victoria showed was men and women, but a lot of those men and women are working together as a family or as a husband and wife or as a group. So that is a very interrelated familial value chain as well. And then transitional shifts just points to the fact that social norms are deeply ingrained in our societies, they're culturally ingrained, and to change them in a positive way in order for more people to have their human rights recognised, it will take time, and it does need to be done in a very contextually informed and a safe way. So we've got ideas in this report about how you do that in terms of those partnerships and drawing on local GEDSI advice and expertise. The next slide talks about recommendations in terms of building capacity of our own organisations and also people in the sectors we work with, especially if they're very technical sectors, and the research gaps, the need for monitoring evaluation to go beyond just counting people, as John talked about. We need to move more into that qualitative and deeper research and monitoring evaluation to understand what the actual changes in people's lives are, or the challenges around damming or stopping flows in rivers or climate change impacts on waterways. The mainstreaming and targeted actions I've talked about, and that was on John's slide as well, about having a twin-tracked approach and thinking about things in an overall sense, but also in a very focused way based on specific people's needs. And then finally, the responsibility and accountability point is really related to the fact that we all in all of our organizations are responsible for advancing this agenda, not only because, for instance, this webinar, we're part of the Australian Water Partnership, which is funded by the Australian government. The Australian government has now issued a new international development policy, which calls for 80% of our aid investments to be inclusive, to focus on gender equality inclusion in some way, in a meaningful way. And so we're beholden to that agenda, and it's the morally correct agenda as well, but the way in which we do it needs to happen sector by sector, agency by agency, and that's going to be very nuanced and very culturally informed and very tailored to the different stakeholders. So that last point is really about all of us holding that responsibility and accountability, not only the GEDC experts, not only the rights holder organisations, not only community members. Okay, so the next slide is just to mention that the AWP has guidance for partners. So if there are AWP partners in the room, you may be familiar with this document, and it's very good at providing additional concrete advice as to what to do in different projects as a starting point. So that might be a policy-oriented project, it might be a capacity building project, an event, it might be a training, it might be a piece of research, and all of those types of projects are outlined in this guidance as to what some ideas are for starting points to consider GEDC. And it also outlines the requirements for achieving an acceptable GEDC rating on behalf of the AWP to achieve funding from the AWP, and that is assessed by the expert review panel. There's 3 GEDC advisors and reviewers. I'm one of them, and we look at project proposals and we assess them against these criteria. So before any proposals come to the AWP, we need every partner to use those guidelines and talk to them directly and say, this is how my project relates to the guidelines and responds to the guidelines. Next slide, please. So without further ado, drum roll, I'd like to formally launch the Water, Food and Gender Equality Synergies report, which was lead authored by Victoria Siddall, and she has done an incredible job to drive the writing and the research of this report. And I also just want to thank and acknowledge the partners from the region that have supported us in the development of this report, with the case studies, with the information, the literature review. As I said, this report sits as part of a bigger project which has got a lot of capacity development and engagement elements. And we really hope that this report will be useful to our partners and to the AWP family more generally, and anyone working in fisheries space and natural resource management. So thank you, Dr. Victoria Siddall, for your amazing work on this report, and huge round of applause. I'm happy to say that you can get that report now at the URL, which should be in the chat. Otherwise, we'll put it there in a minute. And also in that QR code, which is at the top of the screen there. I'm now going to hand back to Shreya and the AWP team. Thank you all very much for listening to that very speedy 101 on GEDC concepts, and also how it relates to the food, water, gender equality nexus and the 3 SDGs in relation to that. Thank you.
Thanks, Melita. Thank you for that very insightful presentation, and I guess particularly for highlighting the need to take responsibility and accountability, but also to reflect as practitioners on our ways of working and how we're implementing projects. And I think the Q&A session would be a perfect opportunity for us to do that. And so I'd really encourage all of you joining from all over the world today to please ask questions and really take this opportunity to reflect on how we can better integrate GEDC in our ways of working. I'd also just like to say, everyone, please take the time out to read through this learning brief because it would really inform our work as practitioners and policymakers. Now I'll move to the Q&A session. We already have a few questions, and we'll keep taking the questions as and when people put in the Q&A box. I think I'll start with a question for John. John, there's a question for you, and it says, there's no doubt that small fish is important for local people for nutrition as well as livelihood. However, how do we ensure sustainability for the future, particularly, I guess, given the impacts of climate change as well as the growing population?
That's a very good question. Thank you for the question. I'll just start. I forgot how international the crowd would be. When I said ACR, I just wanted to clarify that I meant the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research. They've been the major funder for the last decades. And when I said DFAT, I meant the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Sorry, I was using acronyms, and that's poor. Fishways are one component of maintaining productive fisheries, and as you know, you need a functioning ecosystem, and Melita's pointed that out in the past, that water security, so water abstraction, if you're removing all the water from the river, that won't lead to sustainable fisheries. Habitat quality is another challenge, and as climate change increases, you're going to need sort of this more holistic approach to dealing with productive fisheries, especially as infrastructure becomes even more dominant in the landscape than what it already is, as countries work very hard towards trying to meet food security goals, and rice is that food security goal still set by nearly all countries in Southeast Asia. And inland fisheries in some ways is a little bit, especially wild capture fisheries, is somewhat neglected at the moment, and that may be because within the governance structures and the policy structures that fisheries isn't well captured in there. So we've definitely got a more focus on institutionalizing that component within it. And then just from the fish side of things, I really think it's around that more holistic approach of, so fishways will move your fish, but they need to be moving into suitable habitat with the amount of suitable water and the ability to move in and out of floodplains. And yeah, that takes a lot of different institutions working together to do that.
Thank you, John. I'll now move on to a question for Melita. I guess I'll just, frame that question a bit broadly. What role can local communities, NGOs, and government agencies play in driving the adoption of the JETSI framework and JETSI responsive approaches in fisheries management and development programs? And I guess, how does that sit within broader national policies and program structures?
Thank you, Shreya. Yes, look, as I said, we're all responsible for this, and it does start with our own organizations taking responsibility for informing ourselves and building our own knowledge and capacity. So having those insightful conversations and trainings and exposure to different stories and different experiences. So definitely doing that internal work within each organization. And then, yes, it does come down to improving processes that are already starting to become the norm. So stakeholder engagement is just accepted as a thing that has to happen, but to what extent and in what ways and who's included and how much influence and power do they have over the final decision. So it's really about making stakeholder engagement, whether in any of those organizations you mentioned, more inclusive and deeper and better. And I would say that another thing that those, NGOs, government agencies, local communities can do is be more aware of that whole value chain that Victoria talked about, and just be mindful of that bigger picture. And you may want to work on a particular aspect of the value chain because that's seen as a gap or an Achilles heel or something that's a real need. That's fine, but understand that it's part of a bigger ecosystem within that value chain, and that it may have flow-on effects to other members of that value chain. And then to inform that, I guess we need better research. Obviously, I would say that coming from a university, we need better research and better knowledge to underpin that sort of thinking and those sorts of decision-making processes, including the stakeholder engagement. So more meaningful research, more meaningful stakeholder engagement will obviously help to drive those benefits you talked about. And I did notice there's a question, I think, that you're also mentioning there, Shreya, around the trade, the one from Catherine around, are there trade-offs needed to achieve transformational change, or does everybody win? Is it a win-win? And certainly the literature shows that if you have more inclusive processes, you will have more sustainable outcomes, not only for the community, because the more of the community benefits from the project, the processes, but as John said about infrastructure, unless there is very good engagement and very good process, infrastructure will not last. It will not be maintained. The O&M won't be there. The understanding of why it's important won't be there. It may be in the wrong place. It may be dangerous. It may be culturally inappropriate. So you actually just get better results with more inclusive processes. So it is a win-win for all, and it's not about taking all of the men's jobs in fisheries and giving them to women. It's not about that. It's recognizing all of those different roles and ensuring that we support different parts of the system so that some people don't miss out. Thank you.
Thanks, Melita. I'll now move on to a question for Victoria. How does a gender-sensitive value chain mapping approach in fisheries contribute to identifying and addressing specific gender-based constraints and opportunities within the value chain?
Sorry. Thanks, Shreya. So this question touches on several of the guiding principles from GEDC Fisheries, including valuing women's roles and identifying and making them visible, but also the benefits, considering the benefits of inclusion. Using the value chain, as I showed you in one of my earlier slides, it shows you how do we know who to include without first knowing where they sit within the value chain, and it makes visible those invisible and more informal roles that might not necessarily be considered in a more economic, having a more economic lens on that. So those roles that are unpaid, for example, the carer roles who support fishers, or aren't necessarily called fishers because they're helping their husbands or helping the husbands with fishing and marketing of those fish. And it also provides context for a particular fishery, and it identifies where those gendered roles might require further investigation. So then you can identify obstacles for inclusion. It can also be used as a workshopping tool to highlight those invisible roles and other issues, and gives context. And also the challenges from that. What do you do with that information that you gain, i.e. kind of tackling those changes needed in the deep-rooted social norms and ideas to redesign those roles, if needed to redesign the roles or accommodate for them. Thank you. I hope I answered it.
Thanks, Victoria. I'll take the next question for John. This is on constructing a fishway on the irrigation system. Fishways could help secure sufficient food and nutrition for the local people. However, how can we make sure that the fishway will not become the best channel for local people to catch the fish from the irrigation canal or river?
Thank you. That's actually a really good question. And we talk about that a lot within what we do in Southeast Asia, as opposed to some of the differences in, say, Australia or whatever, where we try to keep fish out of irrigation canals. Irrigated landscapes and irrigation canals sometimes, especially in Southeast Asia, can be some of the most productive systems. Local people utilize irrigation infrastructure, irrigated systems such as canals, not just for watering their crops, but for bathing and fishing and water and lots of other things. And so we, as I talked about before, we can design and build fishways quite easily, but it's a human understanding that we spend the majority of our time on in these projects. And that comes down to, within the irrigated landscape, is understanding your situation that you're in very well, using good frameworks to do that. So one of the ones we're using is called a MODA framework, which is based around motivations and abilities of stakeholders. And so who are those stakeholders? What's their motivations to around fishways? What's their abilities to implement or institutionalize or manage fishways? And then, as is being presented today, is understanding, why are we building a fishway, and is that focused around gender aspects, or is it focused around nutrition aspects, or both, which are often related? Yeah, so I would say understanding your situation very well before you start to pour concrete.
Thanks, John. We have a few more questions coming in for Victoria. With inclusion in the value chain, how can we maintain balance between economic and inclusion? How can we maintain the balance between economics and inclusion for diverse stakeholders? And also, what are some possibilities for genuine inclusion of women in the co-design of infrastructure, especially fishways?
Thanks, Shreya. I'll answer the first one. So that's really how do we have sustainability and development, really? So sustainability for who and sustainability for what? So is it sustainability for the fish or the... Yes, that's a curly question. Thank you for the question. Yeah, so including people across a range of roles within the fishery, and understanding what their needs are, not just economic, but also social, food security, and having those kind of values. What do you want? What equitable outcomes do you want from a fishery? And involving a multi-scaled approach to the governance, from the local to the regional. And I think I've answered your question. And then the second question from Meryl. Thanks, Meryl. Hi, Meryl. What are the possibilities for genuine inclusion of women in the co-design of infrastructure, especially in fisheries? So having the time, as John was talking, I feel like this question also is for John. So, and having the understanding of what the barriers are for women, but also getting them in the room and having them at the table to voice what they need in terms of what are the issues with the fishways, how do we redesign them so we can include our issues, for example, children playing in the fishways and having them more safe for children, having them in the room to voice their concerns and issues, and also establishing connections across the village to the people that are developing the infrastructure. Yeah, and developing rapport over time, so you understand who and what of the village and those roles.
If you want me to just add quickly to that, Shreya?
Yes.
So I think it comes back to, from our perspective in a project like Fish Tech, it comes back to the perspective of mainstreaming it so that everyone within the project is thinking about these human aspects and GEDSI aspects within what they're doing, whether they're a technical engineer or whether they are a governance advisor, which have both of those in the team. And then taking that more targeted approach, such as the case study level that we're working at, and Slang and Victoria mentioned it, that so one of the things we found out through the inclusion of women and having a more GEDSI based focus was the safety around fishways, and that they were worried that children would get captured in these fishways and drown. And so, yeah, would we then incorporate fences on top of the fishway that so children weren't able to enter? That's a simpler question around the technical aspects, and then around the social aspects is about what are the gender and the social aspects of those communities, and what are they eating? Are they, if you eat the flesh of the bigger fish, yes, you'll get protein, but you won't get nutrients, or as many nutrients. And if you're eating those small fish, which is really important for those children and elderly people, then you should be eating, all of those small fish, and then that becomes our focus within the fishways and those communities. And we've found that within the targeted case studies that we're taking now within Fish Tech.
Thanks, John. There's a question for Melita. Fisheries are interrelated with value chains within a family. What are your suggestions on some effective stakeholder engagement and or research at possibly household levels where all family members are involved? Do you think that would be more practical and there could be more valuable findings from that?
Thank you. Yes, thank you for picking up on that point about the family roles, and a lot of these sorts of businesses are family businesses, so we need to look at that whole system. I guess in our work, in terms of the research piece, we would conduct interviews with the different family members and ask them questions about what they eat, as John said, and where they catch fish or how they sell it, how they their transportation modes, as well as Victoria talked about, and really get a deeper picture from the different people in the family about how they interact with fishing or fisheries in that community, but also asking questions about access to water and ways in which people interact with water and even plants by rivers, etc. Because that bigger, deeper picture of how people use the river or the natural resource and the fisheries then helps build a picture of what needs to be strengthened, because there's already some wonderful things in place. So a strengths-based approach to building on and strengthening what's there, but also identifying any challenges or risks that may come if there's going to be a change to that river system or the natural resource base. So we do interviews separately with people, obviously focus groups, as I mentioned before, partnering with rights holder organizations and bringing them into that research process so they can themselves be part of asking questions or gathering information, because they're experts in their own communities and they know people and can really get to the heart of issues as well. So those research partnerships are key to getting good quality information that you can use. And just a quick example in the water sanitation space, which could be easily adopted in this fisheries space if it was deemed appropriate, is that if women, if you're going to do a targeted approach, so say you want to support women fishers that are working in this particular area and selling at that particular market, and the women want better access to market and they want better equipment, potentially those sorts of things. So if you're going to do a targeted action to support those particular fishers, making sure that when you bring those women into the program or into the initiative, that their husbands are also invited to be part of, say, might be information sessions or consultations, that their husbands, if she is going to receive some training, that he is invited to be part of the initial information sessions or setting up of the training, because our partners in some countries have found that by having an inclusive family approach to supporting women in particular, like just taking a targeted approach, will help to reduce backlash and help to reduce her support from her family, which is so important for her to be able to take up those opportunities. So that's all I'll say on that one. Thank you for the question. Excellent question.
Thanks, Melita. There are a few questions for John. I'll just read through them as they're coming. So John, do you have any success stories of fish keeping in irrigation reservoir? And also, how have you adapted your monitoring, evaluation, and learning approaches over the over the duration of a decade through which fish tech was being implemented to better include and consider JETSI?
Yes, and it's really nice to see some names from Myanmar on the call, that's for sure. Fish keeping in reservoirs can be successful if the life cycle requirements of the fish that are in those reservoirs is met. So that can be habitat related or water quality related. You won't get all types of such as really high, possibly high quality saleable fish from that, but you can certainly support good numbers of community-based fisheries in irrigation reservoirs, especially if the habitat and the water is correct, and that also includes irrigation canals, which can be thousands, which across Southeast Asia now make up thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of kilometres of water within that system. So it's certainly an area to explore, but I will also say that nothing replaces wild capture fisheries from within rivers and floodplains. They simply can't be met through other means. So how have you adapted your monitoring and evaluation and learning approaches over the decade? So now we have, so before, as I said, we were much more metric based around number of women, number of families engaged or people engaged, and now we have not set metrics about, so we still have the output based metrics about numbers of people, X, Y, what X, Y, and Z. But we also have now we're taking through our JETSI strategy and also through through our conversations with DFAT around utilising what actually Gary Thorncraft has put in here around that JETSI is a great way of telling the story of how you involve the community and how that community is important. So there's the case study aspect, which is that targeted approach, and we'll draw metrics from that in relation to the strategy. There's the more mainstreamed approach, which is just around what are we doing in relation to JETSI and what does that mean for numbers? And then we're also exploring these other options around reporting and that on more storyline basis. And then the last component of that is around the MODA program that we've also, the MODA framework that we've also been utilising, which is, and there's people in country now doing those interviews around how do the communities use utilise, own or institutionalise fishways within their own landscapes. And I would say that we're in those initial stages of improving that within Fish Tech, and it'll be interesting to see from our perspective actually how we take that into our future programs as well.
Thanks, John. We might just take one last question that's on the Q&A box, and I might just open that question to all the speakers today. And this question is really around acknowledging that JETSI is really a great way to tell stories around engaging local communities, around all the approaches that you have mentioned, and acknowledging that there's a really diversity of audience and practitioners and people working in the space of sustainable development goals. I guess, what are some ways of sharing these stories outside of the project areas, as well as communities and the region? How do we use the approaches and learnings that you have shared and apply it elsewhere in the region and beyond?
I can jump in first if you like.
Yeah.
Just to give an example of our partnership with Gender Development Association in Laos, PDR, and they are an organisation that have supported multiple water resource management projects and brought their expertise to those, but they operate across the country, so they're able to take their understanding from one context and build on that and take it to another context. So by, again, partnering with a leading women's organisation in Laos, we've been able to, AWP has been able to support them to inform the projects, but also for them to take those findings to other contexts, or that understanding, because they're staying there. And so they can take the knowledge from the Namsam River Basin and apply it to another river basin, because they've got those understandings of process, not necessarily the detail of each context, but some of those processes that are really tailored to that particular context. So wonderful question about telling stories and also sharing knowledge across jurisdictions. Thank you.
Thanks, Melita. Victoria, would you like to go next?
Yeah, thanks, Shreya. I just add to that. So it's really important to have those on the ground networks and word of mouth around, the good stories. But also having those stories documented is really important to get out to the wider international community, either through publication or through reports, government-led, and could be NGOs as well. And so, and then just also education and outreach to other communities around the world. And that could be also, filtered down from those stories that have been documented in those more formalized kind of documents. Thanks.
Thanks, Victoria. John?
Yeah, I would just say, in relation to having a large emphasis on local partners, and really knowing, again, getting back to that, understanding your situation extremely well. And we, in our projects, we start with that from the embassy, our own embassy, and all the way down to the local fishers. And then we also, outside of that, is partnering with the correct institutions that have those abilities, such as what you're talking about, Melita, with the women's group in Laos, which would be a really good one for us to talk to for our motor. And I would say within Fish Tech, we're now starting to broaden out what we would have traditionally focused on: fishers and maybe farmers, water managers, because fishers and farmers can often be the same. And there's even, as we talked about, whereas now we are actually focusing outside of that and looking towards, are there any women's groups? Are there any disability groups? How are those aspects of the community situated within where we're building our fishways? We have a prioritisation process on, there's thousands of barriers within any catchment. We need to be able to prioritise that because we cannot pass every barrier. And those human aspects within our prioritisation process are becoming more dominant in how we prioritise fishways, as opposed to before it may have been around numbers of fish and the ability to access more habitat for fish. So yeah, bringing it to the forefront of a lot of what we do, but putting it into good frameworks such as your prioritisation process. How is it mainstreamed? How is it monitored and evaluated? And where are your targeted approaches?
Thanks, John. And thank you to all the audience for such enthusiastic questions. I'll now hand over to Rowan Kent, who's the AWP program lead, to provide some final reflections today. Over to you, Rowan.
Thanks very much, everyone. And firstly, I'd just like to thank Dr. Victoria Siddle and Melissa for their excellent work on this project and the report, supported by the FAO, but also Charles Sturt University with the case study. So well done to all involved, and also an acknowledgement of the people in country as well that helped with this report as well. I know it was tricky there for a minute or two with some sites, but well done on the production of it. Just also like to thank the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade for their ongoing support of Australian Water Partnership and reports such as this, and really emphasising the fact that you know, the 80% needs to really focus on inclusion and meaningful inclusion with the 80% GENC investment in projects in the development space. So we're very much in support of that. Just briefly recapping some of the key points that I picked up. I think Victoria, I need to be spotlighted apparently. Sorry, we'll just, yep, I'll keep going. So yeah, look, I think some of the key points that were picked up by that I picked up from Victoria's section there. I quite like the, you know, the gender sensitive value chain mapping around the pre-fishing, fishing, processing, trading, and then the governance, especially around the household finance and access levels. I think, you know, these are sort of things that can be applied across sectors, but having that applied across the fishing sector was particularly useful. And understanding the predominantly gendered roles of small-scale fishing, but also then the 8 principles that were highlighted, in particular the benefits of inclusion. Context is key, context is king almost, but also addressing the root causes of the issues is absolutely vital, along with the others, inclusion, women's roles valued, do no harm, multi-sector governance and resourcing. Dr. John Connellan with Lee Beauregard in the background, no doubt, and the fish tech was really interesting to see and to listen and learn to what they had found with regards to embracing GENC, to take it on as a more accurate, and evaluate GENC from theory and academia through into the reality in country. And I think this is that came through in their case study and how they were able to elevate their case study and their approach with the GENC lens. So they knew who they were talking to and who they were building the fisheries for. It's obviously very important that we make sure the people that we're working with and for are the ones that are receiving the support, especially within the communities. I think it's also key that John was also able to mention. It's easy to build infrastructure, but it's the ownership and the ongoing management into the future, which is where the twin track approach really sort of comes to mind, with the mainstream, but also the targeting approach of development programs in general, but in particular the fishery program. Melissa spoke to us about the nexus and the synergies around irrigation, nutrition, groundwater management, which is all important here. But equally important is the access to fish for food and livelihoods, which I thought is a really good takeaway for us all here. But I was really impressed with the spectrum there, which I think is another resource that we can all take away to add to not just fish programs, but all our development programs, the insensitive, sensitive, responsive, and transformative. And I think, you know, again, with that key consideration of do no harm, it's the key principle there. It's very important and something that we can adapt and ensure that all our programs have a spectrum such as the one that Melissa explained. And again, the conclusions around holistic approaches, cross-sectoral approaches, improved understanding and intersectionality are obviously very important, not at the end, but also at the beginning as well as we're designing and planning these projects. I would just like to I guess, wrap up to highlight how the learning brief provides this in-depth research of women's roles into fisheries and explores the interconnections of water, food and gender using the case studies, but also really highlights the diversity in decision-making and the cross-sectional collaboration between the water resource management sector and the water sanitation and hygiene sectors to ensure sustainability and community resilience. It's important, I think, in design, as we've heard from the case studies, but also from the lead authors here, to sit and take a bit more time when you're designing these projects to make sure that we're targeting and supporting the right people across all spectrums here. Take time to design, but take time to monitor and evaluate as well. I think it's pertinent to say we talk and we make suggestions, but it's also equally important to listen. And when we're listening to the people that we're working with as our partners, we often find out some of those nuances that we may have missed as we come in and assume. So I think it's really important to listen. And to listen is also to be a leader as well as to talk and be a leader. Being aware of those power dynamics and being brave enough to leave your own bias at the door. We were talking about this in another project just before, but it helps to understand the context, understand the power dynamics that you may not see, that you may have assumed. But if you leave your own bias at the door, it's really important to open your own eye, that will open your own eyes to really what's going on the ground. The other 2 points I think were really emphasised, the localisation and the localisation agenda that we're all aware of, to embrace knowledge, local knowledge, to embrace local ownership, and to learn again from the local input is really essential in development programming, not just fish, but all the water sanitation and hygiene and water resource management programming that we're all doing. But then that helps us with our responsibility and accountability. And finally, with another vote of thanks to the lead authors and the teams behind them and with them in country, please remember to do no harm when you're out there. This is a great resource for us all, really highlights these key elements. And for me, the do no harm was really coming through as a very strong thread throughout the whole process. So with that, I would like to thank again, Melissa and all her efforts in part there. I would also like to thank John and Lee for their case study. And I would also like to thank Dr. Victoria Siddell for her efforts as well. Thank you very much for your attendance. Thank you very much for your questions, which were excellent. And we look forward to working with you all again in the future.
Thank you. That was some great takeaways and call to action. I think I'd just like to remind everyone to access the learning brief on our website and also keep an eye out for future webinars and EWP events. Thank you all once again.